July 1st, 1863 dawned, cool and misty across the rolling Pennsylvania farmland, and no one in the small town of Gettysburg could have imagined that within hours their quiet crossroads would become the stage for the most consequential battle ever fought on American soil. The clatter of cavalry hooves echoed through the streets as Confederate scouts rode in from the west, their gray uniforms dusty from days of marching, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of Union forces. What began as a chance encounter between advance units would soon explode into 3 days of unimaginable carnage that would determine whether the United States would survive as one nation or fracture forever into two. General Robert Edward Lee had gambled everything on this northern invasion. After his stunning victory at Chancellorsville in May, where his Army of Northern Virginia had humiliated a Union force twice its size, Lee convinced Confederate President Jefferson Davis that the time had come to take the war onto northern soil. The logic was compelling. Virginia had been ravaged by 2 years of warfare, its farms depleted, its people exhausted. A successful campaign in Pennsylvania could threaten Washington itself, force President Abraham Lincoln to negotiate peace, and perhaps even convince Britain and France to recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate nation. Lee's army of 75,000 men had crossed the Potomac River in mid-June, moving up through Maryland's western valleys and into Pennsylvania's rich farmlands. The soldiers marveled at the abundance they found. Barns full of grain, livestock grazing in green pastures, towns untouched by war's destruction. For men who had subsisted on meager rations for months, it seemed like a land of plenty. Lee issued strict orders against pillaging, insisting his army conduct itself with discipline, hoping to show Northerners that the South fought for principle, not plunder. Meanwhile, the Army of the Potomac, now under the command of General George Gordon Meade, shadowed Lee's movements from the east. Meade had assumed command just 3 days earlier, replacing the discredited Joseph Hooker, and he carried the weight of a nation's desperate hopes on his shoulders. Lincoln had cycled through commanders repeatedly, each one failing to stop Lee's seemingly invincible army. Now Meade, a cautious and methodical Pennsylvanian, found himself responsible for stopping the greatest threat the Union had ever faced. His 90,000 soldiers marched hard through the Maryland countryside, pushing north to intercept Lee before the Confederate army could threaten Harrisburg or Philadelphia. Neither commander initially intended to fight at Gettysburg. Lee had ordered his scattered corps to concentrate near Catchtown 8 miles to the west, while Meade preferred to establish a defensive line along Pipe Creek in northern Maryland. But war has its own momentum, driven by individual decisions made by men who cannot see the larger picture. When Brigadier General John Buford's Union Cavalry Division rode into Gettysburg on June 30th, he immediately recognized the tactical importance of the high ground surrounding the town. Roads converged here from every direction like spokes on a wheel, and whoever controlled these ridges would command the battlefield. Buford posted his dismounted troopers along the western ridges and sent urgent messages to Major General John Reynolds, whose First Corps was marching nearby. The cavalrymen knew Confederate infantry was approaching from the west, and he understood that if he could hold them until Reynolds arrived with reinforcements, the Union Army might seize the advantageous terrain before Lee could concentrate his forces. As darkness fell on June 30th, Buford's men built small fires and checked their carbines, knowing that morning would likely bring a fight. They could hear Confederate campfires flickering in the distance and the low murmur of thousands of Southern voices drifting across the fields. Neither side slept well that night, sensing that something momentous was about to unfold. According to historical accounts preserved in the official records of the War of the Rebellion, Buford reportedly told his officers that night, "The enemy will come booming. Skirmishes 3 deep. You will have to fight like the devil until supports arrive." Dawn on July 1st broke gray and humid across the fields west of Gettysburg, and Brigadier General John Buford stood atop the Lutheran Theological Seminary's cupola, scanning the western horizon through his field glasses. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. Long columns of Confederate infantry emerging from the morning mist, their bayonets glinting, their red battle flags rippling in the breeze. Major General Henry Hett's division, advancing toward Gettysburg in search of shoes and supplies, had stumbled upon Buford's cavalry pickets around 7:30 that morning, and within minutes the sharp crack of carbine fire echoed across the peaceful farmland. Buford's 2,700 cavalrymen, fighting dismounted with their breech-loading carbines, held a fragile line along McPherson's Ridge. Every fourth man held horses in the rear, while his comrades fired from behind fence rails and rocky outcroppings. The rapid-fire carbines gave them an advantage against the slower muzzle-loading rifles carried by Confederate infantry, but numbers would soon tell. Hett deployed to brigades and pushed forward, confident he could brush aside what he assumed was merely a cavalry screen. His men advanced in neat lines, their officers shouting encouragement, drums beating the cadence of attack. For 2 desperate hours, Buford's troopers held their ground through sheer determination and superior firepower. They fell back slowly from one ridge to another, contesting every stone wall and every copse of trees, buying precious time for Reynolds and the First Corps to arrive. Around 10 o'clock that morning, Reynolds himself rode up to the seminary, conferred briefly with Buford, and immediately grasped the situation's urgency. He sent orders for his 3 divisions to hurry forward, while he personally led Brigadier General James Wadsworth's division into action. Reynolds directed the Iron Brigade, the 1st Corps' most famous unit, to advance through McPherson's woods on the left of the line. These men from Wisconsin, Indiana, and Michigan wore distinctive black hardy hats and had earned their nickname through hard fighting in previous battles. They crashed into Brigadier General James Archer's Tennessee Brigade in a savage collision among the oak trees. Within moments, the woods filled with smoke and the deafening roar of thousands of rifles firing at close range. Men clubbed each other with muskets when they had no time to reload. Archer himself was captured, the first Confederate general taken prisoner since Lee assumed command, but victory came at a terrible price. As Reynolds rode among the trees, directing his troops forward, a Confederate sharpshooter's bullet struck him behind the ear, killing him instantly. The highest-ranking Union officer to fall at Gettysburg died in the battle's first hours, and his loss stunned his soldiers. Reynolds had been one of the Army of the Potomac's most capable commanders, and his death deprived Meade of a trusted subordinate at a critical moment. Major General Abner Doubleday assumed command and continued feeding troops into the expanding battle. Throughout the morning, more units from both armies converged on Gettysburg like pieces on a chessboard moving toward collision. Major General Oliver Otis Howar's 11th Corps arrived from the south and took position north of town, extending the Union line into a fishhook shape. But Lee's army was also concentrating rapidly. Lieutenant General Richard Stoddert Ewell's 2nd Corps approached from the north, and by early afternoon, Howard found himself facing a massive Confederate force that outnumbered his already battered troops. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Ewell unleashed his divisions against Howard's 11th Corps. The attack came crashing down from Oak Hill and across the open fields north of town with overwhelming force. Major General Robert Rhodes's division struck from the northwest, while Major General Jubal Early's division hammered the Union right flank from the northeast. The 11th Corps, still carrying the stigma of its rout at Chancellorsville 2 months earlier, fought stubbornly at first but could not withstand the coordinated assault. Brigade after brigade broke under the pressure, and soon entire regiments were streaming back through the streets of Gettysburg in confusion. The Union line collapsed like a house of cards. Soldiers who had fought magnificently all morning suddenly found themselves flanked and outnumbered, with no choice but retreat or surrender. Thousands of men ran through Gettysburg's narrow streets, Confederate pursuers close behind, musket balls whizzing past buildings and shattering windows. Townspeople huddled in their cellars, terrified by the battle raging through their homes, the Union soldiers fleeing through Gettysburg's streets on that chaotic afternoon of July 1st streamed southward in desperate disorder, and their only hope of salvation lay on the high ground beyond the town where Cemetery Hill rose like a natural fortress. Major General Oliver Otis Howard, watching his corps dissolve before his eyes, had shown remarkable foresight hours earlier by posting Brigadier General Adolph von Steinwehr's division on this commanding ridge as a reserve. Now that single decision would save the Union Army from complete disaster. Cemetery Hill dominated the landscape south of Gettysburg, a steep wooded elevation crowned by the town's cemetery with its white monuments and iron gates. From its crest, artillery could command all approaches, and infantry posted along its slopes would enjoy tremendous defensive advantages. As the broken remnants of the 1st and 11th Corps poured up the Baltimore Pike, officers and sergeants worked frantically to restore order, grabbing men by their collars, forming them into makeshift battle lines, pointing them toward the enemy they had just fled. Major General Winfield Scott Hancock arrived on Cemetery Hill around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, sent by Meade with orders to assess the situation and assume command until Meade himself could reach the field. Hancock was everything the moment required, calm under pressure, inspiring to soldiers, and blessed with an instinct for terrain. He rode along the ridge, his tall figure unmistakable, and immediately saw that this position could be held. More importantly, he recognized that the terrain south of Cemetery Hill formed a natural defensive line that, if properly occupied, could anchor the entire Union Army. The question burning in every Union officer's mind was whether Lee would order an immediate assault on Cemetery Hill while the defenders remained disorganized. Confederate troops had pursued the routed Federals to the base of the ridge, and some Southern officers believed one more push would carry the heights and complete the victory. Lieutenant General Richard Ewell, commanding Lee's 2nd Corps, received discretionary orders from Lee to take Cemetery Hill if practicable, but chose not to attack. His reasons seemed sound at the moment. His own troops were disorganized from the day's fighting. He faced artillery posted on the heights, and he had no clear picture of what reinforcements might be arriving to support the Union position. That decision, or indecision, would haunt Confederate memory forever. Lee's aggressive instincts told him to press the advantage, but he had given Ewell discretion rather than direct orders, and Ewell had exercised that discretion cautiously. Within hours, as Union corps continued arriving throughout the night, the opportunity to take Cemetery Hill evaporated like morning mist. Major General Henry Slocum's 12th Corps and Major General Daniel Sickles's 3rd Corps marched in during the evening, and by midnight, Meade himself arrived to take personal command. The Union line solidified along Cemetery Hill, extending south along Cemetery Ridge toward to modest elevations that would soon become famous, Little Round Top and Big Round Top. Lee established his headquarters along Seminary Ridge west of town, and as reports came in from his scattered corps commanders, he began forming his plan for July 2nd. He had won a clear tactical victory on the first day, driving the Union Army through Gettysburg and inflicting heavy casualties. The town itself now lay in Confederate hands, and thousands of Union prisoners were being marched to the rear. But Lee recognized that the Union Army had not been destroyed, merely pushed back to strong defensive ground. His invasion of Pennsylvania would accomplish nothing unless he could defeat Meade decisively. Lieutenant General James Longstreet, Lee's most capable corps commander and closest military confidant, arrived at headquarters that evening and immediately urged a different course. After studying the Union position through his field glasses, Longstreet argued for a flanking movement southward, positioning the Confederate Army between Meade and Washington, forcing Meade to attack them in a position of their choosing. Lee listened but disagreed. His army was concentrated here, the enemy was in front of him, and he believed his soldiers could carry any position if properly led. Moreover, maneuvering around Meade might allow the Union Army to escape, and Lee wanted a decisive battle that would end the war. Throughout the night of July 1st and into the pre-dawn hours of July 2nd, both armies prepared for the coming struggle. Union engineers worked by lantern lights to improve the defensive positions along Cemetery Ridge, piling rocks into improvised breastworks, positioning artillery batteries to cover likely Confederate approach routes. Confederate officers studied the Union lines and planned their assaults. Soldiers on both sides wrote letters home, checked their weapons, and tried to snatch a few hours of sleep. Many of them, veterans of previous battles, recognized that the coming day would bring something terrible and decisive. A young Union private from Maine, writing in his diary that night, captured the mood perfectly. "We can see their campfires all along the ridge opposite us. Tomorrow will be bloody work." July 2nd dawned hot and sultry across the Gettysburg battlefield, and General Robert Edward Lee rose early to finalize his battle plan for what he intended to be the decisive day of the campaign. Lee proposed a coordinated assault against both flanks of the Union line. Lieutenant General James Longstreet would attack the Union left with 2 divisions, rolling up Cemetery Ridge from south to north, while Lieutenant General Richard Ewell would demonstrate against the Union right on Kelp's Hill and Cemetery Hill, converting his feint into a full attack if opportunity presented itself. On paper, the plan possessed elegant simplicity, but its execution would prove far more complex than Lee anticipated. Longstreet disagreed fundamentally with Lee's strategy, and their morning conference grew tense as the corps commander repeated his arguments for a flanking movement rather than a frontal assault. Longstreet had studied the Union position carefully and recognized the strength of the high ground along Cemetery Ridge. His military philosophy favored defensive tactics, forcing the enemy to attack prepared positions, and everything he observed about Meade's line convinced him that attacking it directly would result in terrible casualties. But Lee had made his decision, and Longstreet, however reluctantly, would obey. The attack was supposed to begin early in the morning, but delays accumulated like links in a chain. Longstreet waited for Brigadier General Evander Law's brigade to complete its 25-mile march from Chambersburg. Then the corps had to move into position along Seminary Ridge without being observed by Union signal stations on Little Round Top, requiring a circuitous route that consumed hours. Staff officers rode back and forth, scouts reported Union troop movements, and all the while the morning slipped away. Lee grew increasingly impatient, sending aides to hurry Longstreet forward, but the big Georgian would not be rushed. If he must make this attack against his better judgment, he would at least ensure his troops were properly positioned. Meanwhile, a dangerous gap had opened in the Union line. Major General Daniel Sickles, commanding the 3rd Corps, had been ordered to take position along Cemetery Ridge connecting with the 2nd Corps on his right. But Sickles, a political general with limited military experience and an abundance of personal confidence, disliked the low ground assigned to him. About 3/4 of a mile to his front, a slight ridge rose near a peach orchard, and Sickles convinced himself this constituted better ground for defense. Without authorization from Meade, he advanced his entire corps forward to this new position, creating a salient that jutted out from the Union line like a pregnant bulge. Sickles's unauthorized movement had 3 immediate consequences, all of them dangerous. First, it created a gap between his corps and the 2nd Corps, weakening the Union center. Second, it left Little Round Top virtually undefended except for Signal Corps observers. Third, it positioned his troops in an exposed salient where they could be hit from multiple directions. When Meade discovered what Sickles had done around 3 o'clock that afternoon, he was furious. But before he could order the 3rd Corps back to its proper position, Longstreet's artillery opened fire, and the attack began. 138 Confederate cannons roared to life, their shells screaming across the valley toward Sickles's exposed position. The bombardment lasted nearly an hour, tearing great gaps in Union formations, dismounting artillery pieces, turning the peach orchard into a smoking hell. Then, around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 3 Confederate divisions rose from their positions and advanced toward the Union left. Major General John Hood's division angled toward the massive boulders at the base of Big Round Top, while Major General Lafayette McLaus's division drove straight at the peach orchard, and Major General Richard Anderson's division prepared to strike the gap Sickles had created. Hood's Texans and Alabamians crashed into the boulder-strewn terrain south of the peach orchard. a nightmarish landscape of giant rocks, dense woods, and steep slopes that would earn names from the day's fighting. Devil's Den, the Slaughter Pen, the Valley of Death. The 4th Alabama and the 47th Alabama pushed toward Little Round Top, which they could see was only lightly defended. If they could seize that commanding height, their artillery could enfilade the entire Union line along Cemetery Ridge, making Meade's position untenable. But fortune favored the Union that afternoon in the person of Brigadier General Governor Warren, Meade's chief engineer. Warren had climbed Little Round Top to observe Confederate movements and instantly recognized the mortal danger. The hill was virtually undefended, and Confederate troops were moving toward it through the woods below. Warren sent urgent messages demanding reinforcements, and through a combination of quick thinking and good luck, he managed to get troops onto Little Round Top just minutes before Hood's men arrived. The stage was set for one of the Civil War's most famous small unit actions. Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and his 20th Maine Infantry reached the southern slope of Little Round Top just as Hood's Alabamians began ascending the rocky hill, and the 34-year-old former college professor from Maine understood immediately that he held the extreme left flank of the entire Union Army. Brigadier General Strong Vincent, commanding the brigade that included Chamberlain's regiment, had rushed his 4 regiments to Little Round Top after receiving urgent orders from General Warren, and he positioned them along the southern and western slopes of the hill. Vincent placed Chamberlain's 350 men at the very southern tip of the line and gave him explicit orders: hold this ground at all costs, because nothing stood between him and the rear of the Union Army. The terrain Chamberlain was ordered to defend consisted of massive boulders jumbled together like a giant's playground, with dense undergrowth filling the spaces between rocks. The slope fell away steeply toward a saddle of ground separating Little Round Top from its larger companion, Big Round Top. Chamberlain quickly grasped that his regiment formed a hinge upon which the entire defense would turn. If his line broke, Confederate forces could sweep around behind Little Round Top and render the whole position untenable. He deployed his men in a long thin line, bending his left flank backward at right angles to prevent being outflanked, creating a formation that resembled Around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the 15th Alabama, commanded by Colonel William Oates, emerged from the woods below Chamberlain's position and began climbing the slope. Oates had just led his men on an exhausting trek up and down Big Round Top in search of water in the Union left flank, and his soldiers were already tired and thirsty when they found themselves staring up at the main troops above them. But Oates was a fighter, and he could see that if he could drive the Yankees off this hill, the entire Union position might unravel. He ordered his regiment forward in what would become the first of multiple assaults against Chamberlain's line. The fighting that erupted on Little Round Top's southern slope was desperate and savage. The Alabamians surged upward, firing as they climbed, using boulders for cover, working their way closer to the main line with each rush forward. Chamberlain's men fired down at them, the defensive advantage of high ground partially offset by the difficulty of hitting targets moving upward through heavy cover. Men fell on both sides, wounded soldiers screaming among the rocks, the smoke growing so thick that combatants could barely see each other at 20 paces. For 90 minutes the battle raged on that rocky hillside. Oates launched assault after assault, trying to find a weak point in Chamberlain's line, attempting to work around the main regiment's left flank. Each time, Chamberlain shifted men to meet the threat, stretching his line thinner and thinner. Officers fell. Lieutenant James Nichols was killed. Captain Atherton Clark was wounded. Ammunition began running low. Chamberlain sent men scrounging cartridges from the dead and wounded. Still, the Alabamians came on, driven by Oates's determination and their own desperate courage. By 6:30, Chamberlain faced disaster. His ammunition was nearly exhausted. His line had been reduced to perhaps 200 effective soldiers, and the Alabamians were forming for what appeared to be one final, overwhelming assault. He sent word to Colonel Strong Vincent that his position was critical, but Vincent had been mortally wounded and could not send reinforcements. Chamberlain realized with crystalline clarity that if he waited to be attacked again, his regiment would be overrun. The situation demanded something radical and unexpected. Chamberlain made a decision that would echo through military history. He ordered his regiment to fix bayonets and counterattack. His plan was audacious to the point of recklessness. His left wing would swing down the hill like a door closing, while his right wing remained anchored on the Union line, and the entire regiment would sweep the Alabamians off the slope in one desperate charge. He later wrote that the decision came to him suddenly, not as reasoned calculation but as instinctive necessity, the only move available to a commander who refused to be beaten. The 20th Maine rose from behind their boulders and charged down the hill, screaming the Union battle cry, their bayonets leveled. The Alabamians, surprised by this sudden counterattack at the moment they expected the defenders to break, wavered and fell back. Chamberlain's men crashed into them, capturing dozens of soldiers too exhausted to flee. Oates tried to rally his regiment but found his men streaming back down the slope, their will to fight finally broken. Within minutes, the southern slope of Little Round Top was in Union hands, littered with dead and wounded from both sides. Chamberlain had held, and in holding he had secured the Union left flank and perhaps prevented Confederate victory at Gettysburg. As documented in the official records, Chamberlain later reported that his regiment captured over 100 prisoners and successfully defended the extreme left of the Union line against repeated Confederate assaults. While Chamberlain fought for his life on Little Round Top, the ground north of him had become a churning cauldron of battle where thousands of men from both armies collided in a 20-acre wheat field and the surrounding woods in what would become one of the Civil War's most confused and deadly engagements. The mature wheat, standing waist-high and golden in the July sun, would be trampled and soaked with blood before the evening ended, and ownership of this unremarkable farm field would change hands 6 times as brigade after brigade was fed into the killing ground. Major General Daniel Sickles's 3rd Corps occupied the advanced position around the peach orchard, and when Longstreet's assault crashed into his salient, the fighting spread across a wide front. Major General Lafayette McLaus's division struck the peach orchard directly while Major General John Hood's brigades drove toward Devil's Den and the wheat field. Sickles's men fought stubbornly, contesting every stone wall and fence line. But they were positioned in a salient vulnerable to attack from multiple directions, and the mathematics of the situation worked against them from the start. The peach orchard became the focal point of artillery duels that shook the ground for miles around. Confederate batteries unlimbered along Seminary Ridge and poured shot and shell into the Union positions, while Union artillery responded with counter-battery fire and canister rounds that tore great holes in the advancing Confederate infantry lines. Major General Henry Hunt, the Union Army's chief of artillery and a gifted practitioner of his craft, coordinated the defensive fire with deadly efficiency, but even his skill could not compensate for Sickles's exposed position. Brigadier General Andrew Humphreys's division held the right of Sickles's line along the Emmitsburg Road, and as McLaus's brigades came crashing through the peach orchard, Humphreys found his position becoming increasingly untenable. Confederate infantry poured through the shattered orchard, their officers waving swords and shouting encouragement, battle flags snapping above the smoke. Union regiments fired devastating volleys at close range, the front ranks disappearing in bursts of flame and smoke, but still the Confederates came on, driven by momentum and the intoxication of attack. Around 6 o'clock in the evening, Sickles himself was struck by a cannonball that mangled his right leg so severely that field surgeons amputated it almost immediately. Command of the 3rd Corps passed to Major General David Birney, but by then the Corps' position had become hopeless. Meade, watching the disaster unfold from Cemetery Ridge, rushed reinforcements forward, pulling units from other parts of his line in a desperate effort to shore up his crumbling left flank. The 5th Corps, the 2nd Corps, and elements of the 12th Corps all sent brigades racing toward the sound of the guns. The wheat field became a nightmare landscape where organized battle dissolved into dozens of separate desperate fights. Brigadier General John Caldwell's division from the 2nd Corps counterattacked through the wheat, driving back the Confederate advance temporarily. But then Brigadier General Joseph Kershaw's South Carolina brigade struck Caldwell's flank, and the fighting surged back the other way. Men fired at shapes moving through the smoke, unable to tell friend from foe at distances greater than a few yards. Regiments became tangled with each other, officers lost touch with their commands, and the wheat itself caught fire in places, burning wounded men alive as the battle raged over them. Brigadier General Samuel Zook led his brigade into the maelstrom and was mortally wounded almost immediately, shot through the abdomen as he rode among his troops. Brigadier General George Willard, commanding a brigade of New York regiments, charged Confederate positions near the peach orchard and was killed by artillery fire. The list of casualties among field officers grew with appalling speed. Colonels fell commanding their regiments. Captains took over companies when lieutenants died. Sergeants led squads when all their officers were down. By 8 o'clock in the evening, as darkness finally brought an end to the fighting, the Union line had been driven back from Sickles's advanced position but had stabilized along Cemetery Ridge. The 3rd Corps effectively ceased to exist as an organized fighting force, its regiments scattered and depleted, its losses staggering. But Meade's reinforcements had prevented a complete breakthrough, and the Union line, though battered and pushed back, remained intact. The wheat field lay quiet at last, covered with thousands of dead and wounded men from both armies, the trampled wheat indistinguishable from the blood-soaked earth. The day's fighting had cost both armies terribly, with Confederate casualties approaching 9,000 and Union losses exceeding 9,000. Longstreet had driven the Union left back but had not broken it. Little Round Top remained in Union hands. Cemetery Ridge remained the Union's main defensive position, and Lee, surveying the results of the day's fighting from Seminary Ridge, began planning for July 3rd and what he hoped would be the decisive blow that would win Southern independence. As the battle raged along the Union left on the evening of July 2nd, Lieutenant General Richard Ewell finally launched his corps against the Union right, fulfilling his part of Lee's plan to attack both ends of the Union line simultaneously. But Ewell's attack, which was supposed to be coordinated with Longstreet's assault, did not begin until after 7 o'clock in the evening, hours after Longstreet's divisions had already been committed. This delay would have significant consequences, as it allowed Major General George Meade to shift reinforcements toward his threatened left flank without worrying about simultaneous pressure on his right. Culp's Hill rose southeast of Cemetery Hill, its steep wooded slopes crowned with entrenchments that the Union 12th Corps had spent the previous night and morning constructing. Brigadier General George Greene, a 62-year-old engineer and the oldest Union general on the field, commanded a brigade posted on the hill's summit, and his troops had built formidable breastworks of logs and earth that transformed the natural strongpoint into a miniature fortress. These defensive works would prove their worth when Major General Edward Johnson's division of Confederate infantry came swarming up the hillside as darkness fell. The fighting on Culp's Hill took place largely in darkness, illuminated by muzzle flashes that turned the woods into a flickering hellscape of shadows and sudden light. Johnson's brigade struggled up the steep slopes, using trees for cover, firing at the Union positions above them. The Stonewall Brigade, once commanded by the legendary Thomas Jackson himself, attacked the Union entrenchments with desperate courage but was repeatedly thrown back by devastating volleys from Greene's troops. The defensive works proved their worth. Soldiers firing from behind log breastworks enjoyed enormous advantages over attackers struggling uphill through heavy timber. Greene's brigade numbered only 1,400 men, but the terrain and their entrenchments multiplied their effectiveness. The Confederate assault came close to overwhelming the position through sheer numbers, but Greene's troops held on through hours of close-range combat. At one critical moment, when ammunition began running low, Greene's men threw rocks down at the attackers while reinforcements rushed cartridge boxes forward. The fighting continued until after midnight, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage in the darkness and confusion. Meanwhile, on East Cemetery Hill, Major General Jubal Early's division launched a coordinated assault just as darkness descended over the battlefield. Early's brigades, including the famous Louisiana Tigers commanded by Brigadier General Harry Hayes, stormed up the steep northeastern face of Cemetery Hill in a night attack that ranks among the war's most desperate gambles. The Louisianians and North Carolinians crashed through Union artillery positions near the top of the hill, capturing several batteries and engaging in hand-to-hand combat with their crews and the infantry supports. For perhaps 30 minutes, the outcome hung in the balance as Confederate infantry occupied the crest of East Cemetery Hill, separated from Cemetery Hill proper only by a saddle of lower ground. If Early could reinforce his men and expand his lodgment, the entire Union position might become untenable. But Major General Oliver Howard, commanding the 11th Corps, responded quickly. Rushing forward the 2nd Division under Brigadier General Adolph von Steinwehr, Colonel Samuel Carroll's brigade counterattacked in the darkness, and a savage close-quarters battle erupted around the captured guns. The fighting on East Cemetery Hill was characterized by confusion and incredible violence. Men fired at muzzle flashes in the darkness. Soldiers clubbed each other with muskets. Artillerists defended their guns with rammers and handspikes. The famous Louisiana Tigers, exhausted from their climb and unsupported by follow-up attacks, found themselves isolated and overwhelmed by superior numbers. Gradually, Carroll's troops drove the Confederates back down the slope, recapturing the artillery pieces and restoring the Union line. By midnight, the fighting across the entire battlefield had finally sputtered to an exhausted conclusion. Both armies had suffered terrible losses. Confederate casualties for July 2nd approached 7,000 killed, wounded, and missing, while Union losses exceeded 9,000. The sound of wounded men crying for water echoed across the darkened fields, and burial parties began the grim work of collecting the dead. Surgeons operated by candlelight in field hospitals behind the lines, sawing off shattered limbs and trying desperately to save men who were beyond saving. Lee met with his corps' commanders that night to assess the situation and plan for July 3rd. Longstreet again urged against further attacks, suggesting instead that they maneuver around Meade's left flank and force the Union Army to attack them on ground of their choosing. But Lee believed he had come close to success on July 2nd, that one more concentrated blow might shatter Meade's army. He had attacked the Union flanks with partial success. Now he would strike at the center. Across the valley on Cemetery Ridge, Meade assembled his corps commanders for a council of war. The generals voted unanimously to remain in position and await Lee's next move. Meade predicted, with remarkable accuracy, that having attacked both Union flanks, Lee would next strike at the Union center. He ordered his troops to strengthen their positions during the night and prepare for what morning would bring. July 3rd dawned with fog blanketing the Gettysburg battlefield, and in the pre-dawn darkness Major General Henry Slocum's 12th Corps launched an attack to reclaim the entrenchments on the lower slopes of Culp's Hill that Confederate forces had occupied the previous evening. The plan was simple and brutal. Slocum would blast the Confederates out of the captured positions with concentrated artillery fire, then send his infantry forward to retake the lost ground. What followed was 7 hours of grinding combat that turned Culp's Hill into a killing ground before the day's main event even began. The bombardment commenced around 4:30 in the morning, with more than 20 Union batteries opening fire on the Confederate positions among the trees and rocks of Culp's Hill. The shells tore through the forest canopy, exploding among Major General Edward Johnson's troops, who huddled behind whatever cover they could find. But Johnson's men had spent the night improving their positions, and they held on stubbornly despite the pounding. When the Union infantry advanced around 6 o'clock, they found the Confederates ready to resist. For the next 7 hours, Union brigades repeatedly assaulted the Confederate positions on Culp's Hill, and each time they were thrown back with heavy losses. The fighting was close range and brutal, conducted in dense woods where visibility rarely exceeded 50 yards. Individual regiments charged and countercharged. Companies became separated from their parent units and fought as independent entities. Officers fell at appalling rates, colonels commanding regiments, majors leading battalions, captains directing companies. The casualty lists from Culp's Hill that morning read like a roster of an army bleeding itself white against prepared defensive positions. Around 10:30 in the morning, Johnson finally withdrew his division from Culp's Hill, recognizing that he could not hold the position against continued Union assaults and that Lee needed these troops for the afternoon's planned attack on the Union center. The 12th Corps had suffered over 1,000 casualties in the morning's fighting but had restored the Union line on Culp's Hill. The battle's right flank was secure. While the fighting raged on Culp's Hill, Lee finalized his plans for the great assault that would define July 3rd. He proposed to mass approximately 12,500 infantry in 3 divisions and hurled them across the 3/4-mile open field, separating Seminary Ridge from Cemetery Ridge. The attack would target the Union center, specifically the low copse of trees that marked a slight angle in the Union line. Major General George Pickett's Fresh Virginia Division, which had seen no action in the battle so far, would form the right wing of the assault. Brigadier General James Johnston Pettigrew's division, which had fought on July 1st and taken heavy casualties, would form the left wing. Major General Isaac Trimble's division would follow in support. Longstreet, designated to command the assault, opposed the plan with every argument he could muster. He had studied the Union position carefully and believed that attacking across open ground against entrenched infantry, supported by massed artillery, was military suicide. The previous day's fighting had demonstrated the strength of the Union line. Longstreet pleaded with Lee to reconsider, to maneuver rather than attack frontally, but Lee's mind was made up. His army was concentrated, his enemy was before him, and he believed Southern courage and fighting spirit could carry any position. Lee told Longstreet, "The enemy is there, and I am going to strike him." The morning wore on with unnatural quiet across most of the battlefield as both armies prepared for what they sensed would be a climactic moment. Confederate artillery batteries rolled into position along Seminary Ridge, 170 guns arranged hub to hub, the largest concentration of artillery ever assembled on the North American continent up to that time. Across the valley, Union Artillery Chief Major General Henry Hunt positioned his guns along Cemetery Ridge and on the hills flanking it, preparing to receive the Confederate bombardment and the infantry assault that would follow. The infantry designated for the assault gathered in the woods behind Seminary Ridge, out of sight of Union observers. They were veterans, these men, survivors of previous battles, and they understood what was being asked of them. Some wrote final letters home. Others checked their rifles and filled their cartridge boxes. Officers inspected their commands and offered quiet words of encouragement. Major General George Pickett, a flamboyant Virginian with flowing locks and perfumed uniforms, rode among his troops, radiating confidence he may not have entirely felt. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 signal guns fired in rapid succession, and the Confederate artillery opened fire in what became known as the cannonade. 170 Confederate cannons roared simultaneously, and the sound could be heard in Pittsburgh 140 miles away. The ground shook. Windows rattled in Gettysburg's houses. Smoke billowed up in huge clouds that obscured the battlefield. For nearly 2 hours, the Confederate artillery pounded the Union positions on Cemetery Ridge, the shells screaming overhead and exploding among the Union infantry and artillery positions. Union artillery responded, and for a time the artillery duel became the most intense bombardment ever witnessed in the Western Hemisphere. But Confederate gunnery proved less effective than hoped. Many shells overshot their targets, falling harmlessly behind Cemetery Ridge or exploding in the Union rear areas. The Confederate artillery's chief, Colonel Edward Porter Alexander, had difficulty observing the effect of his fire through the thick smoke. Union infantry, warned by their officers, lay flat behind stone walls and earthworks, minimizing their casualties during the bombardment. Major General Henry Hunt, the Union artillery chief, made a calculated decision that demonstrated his tactical brilliance. After about an hour of counter-battery fire, he ordered most Union guns to cease firing, creating the impression that Confederate fire had silenced them or that Union ammunition was running low. Hunt wanted to conserve ammunition for the infantry assault he knew would follow the bombardment. Confederate observers, seeing Union batteries fall silent, believed they had achieved their objective of suppressing the Union artillery. It was a deception that would cost Lee's army dearly in the hour to come. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the Confederate artillery fire slackened and then ceased altogether, and an eerie silence descended over the battlefield, broken only by the cries of wounded men and the nervous shifting of thousands of soldiers preparing for what they knew would be a terrible ordeal. Major General George Pickett wrote to James Longstreet and asked, "General, shall I advance?" Longstreet, unable to speak the words that would send these men to their likely deaths, simply nodded. Pickett saluted and rode back to his division. Within minutes the order rang out along the Confederate lines. Forward. 12,500 Confederate soldiers emerged from the woods along Seminary Ridge and began forming their battle lines in full view of the Union Army. It was a magnificent and terrible sight that awed observers on both sides. The divisions dressed their lines with parade ground precision, officers on horseback positioning their regiments, battle flags unfurling in the hot July breeze. the sun glinting off thousands of bayonets. Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, commanding the Union Second Corps, watched from Cemetery Ridge and reportedly remarked to an aide that the Confederate formations were beautiful to behold and that it was almost a shame to have to destroy such parade ground precision. The Confederate line stretched nearly a mile wide and several ranks deep. Pickett's division formed the right, with Brigadier General James Kemper's brigade on the far right, Brigadier General Richard Garnett's brigade in the center, and Brigadier General Lewis Armistead's brigade in the second line. Pettigrew's division formed the left, with Trimble's two brigades following in support. The advance began slowly, soldiers struggling to maintain alignment as they crossed split-rail fences and navigated the undulating terrain. The duty they had to cover stretched approximately 3/4 of a mile across open farmland that offered virtually no cover. For the first few hundred yards, the Confederate line advanced in relative quiet, a surreal interlude, broken only by the sound of thousands of feet tramping through the summer grass and officers calling cadence. Union soldiers on Cemetery Ridge watched the spectacle with a mixture of awe and horror, knowing what was about to unfold. Then, as the Confederate line reached the Emmitsburg Road roughly halfway across the valley, the Union artillery opened fire, and hell descended upon the attackers. Major General Henry Hunt's carefully preserved artillery ammunition now proved its worth. 60 Union guns along Cemetery Ridge and on Little Round Top opened fire with devastating effect. Solid shot plowed bloody lanes through the Confederate ranks. Exploding shells burst above the formations, sending deadly shrapnel scything through the packed troops. As the range closed, Union batteries switched to canister, essentially giant shotgun shells that turned cannons into enormous scatterguns, each blast sending hundreds of iron balls tearing through human flesh at close range. The Confederate line staggered under the bombardment but pressed forward with remarkable courage and discipline. When gaps appeared in the formations, soldiers closed ranks and continued advancing. When officers fell, sergeants took command. When color-bearers were shot down, other men snatched up the fallen flags and carried them forward. Brigadier General Richard Garnett, too ill to walk, rode his horse into the attack and was shot from his saddle. His body never identified among the hundreds of dead, but still, the line came on, drawn inexorably toward the copse of trees that marked their objective. As the Confederate troops approached within musket range, Union infantry rose from behind stone walls and earthworks and opened fire with devastating volleys. The 69th Pennsylvania, positioned behind a low stone wall near the copse of trees, fired point-blank into the oncoming Virginians. The Philadelphia Brigade, commanded by Brigadier General Alexander Webb, held the critical angle in the Union line and poured fire into the Confederate ranks from three sides. Men fell in heaps, the front ranks literally mowed down by the concentrated fire, but those behind continued forward, stepping over the bodies of their fallen comrades. A few hundred Confederate soldiers, led by Brigadier General Lewis Armistead with his hat held high on his sword, actually reached the Union lines and poured over the stone wall in what would be forever known as the high-water mark of the Confederacy. Armistead placed his hand on a Union cannon, symbolically claiming it for the South, and shouted for his men to turn the gun against the enemy. But he fell moments later, mortally wounded, and the few hundred Confederates who had reached the Union line found themselves isolated and surrounded. Within minutes, they were killed, captured, or driven back. The Confederate assault collapsed. Those who could turned and began the long retreat back across the bloody valley toward Seminary Ridge, leaving thousands of dead and wounded littering the fields. Of the 12,500 men who began the charge, over 6,000 were casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. Pickett's division was effectively destroyed. All 13 of his regimental commanders were casualties, and the division would never again be a significant fighting force. Pettigrew was wounded, Trimble lost a leg and was captured. The cream of Lee's infantry lay broken on the slopes of Cemetery Ridge. The shattered remnants of Pickett's division streamed back across the valley toward Seminary Ridge in disorganized groups, and General Robert Edward Lee rode forward to meet them, his face showing the anguish of a commander who had asked too much of his soldiers and seen them pay a terrible price for his miscalculation. Lee moved among the retreating troops, calling out to them, taking full responsibility for the disaster. "It is all my fault," he repeated again and again. "It is I who have lost this fight, and you must help me out of it the best way you can." Soldiers who moments before had faced death with incredible courage now broke down weeping at their commander's words. Major General George Pickett, his division destroyed, could barely speak when Lee asked him to prepare his division to resist a possible Union counterattack. "General Lee," Pickett reportedly replied, his voice breaking, "I have no division now." Of the approximately 5,400 men who had followed Pickett into the assault, only 1,500 returned unwounded. Every brigade commander was a casualty. Every regimental commander was killed, wounded, or captured. The casualties extended far beyond numbers. These were Virginia's finest families, the sons of the state's plantation aristocracy, and whole communities would mourn the losses for generations. Lee immediately began preparing for a Union counterattack that he expected would come crashing into his weakened lines at any moment. He ordered artillery batteries repositioned to cover likely avenues of approach. He pulled together fragments of different units to form makeshift defensive lines, He sent staff officers riding across the battlefield to locate and consolidate scattered commands. But the counterattack never came, and historians have debated ever since whether Meade missed a golden opportunity to destroy Lee's army, or whether prudence dictated his caution. Major General George Meade, from his headquarters behind Cemetery Ridge, certainly recognized that Lee's army had been severely damaged by the failed assault, but Meade also knew his own army had been battered by 3 days of intense fighting and had suffered over 23,000 casualties. The First Corps was a shadow of itself after the fighting on July 1st. The Third Corps barely existed as an organized unit after July 2nd. Every corps had been heavily engaged, and ammunition supplies were running low. Moreover, Meade had been in command less than a week and had achieved his primary objective. He had stopped Lee's invasion and defended northern soil. Pursuing a wounded but still dangerous enemy into unknown territory struck him as unnecessarily risky. Longstreet, observing the Union positions for signs of a counterattack, finally allowed himself to believe that Meade would not pursue. He began the melancholy work of caring for the wounded and reorganizing the shattered divisions under his command. The scale of the casualties shocked even veteran soldiers accustomed to battlefield carnage. The field between the ridges was covered with dead and wounded men, and the cries of injured soldiers begging for water echoed across the valley. Soldiers from both sides worked together during the night to bring in the wounded, a temporary truce born of shared humanity in the face of unimaginable suffering. Lee spent the evening of July 3rd meeting with his corps commanders and planning the army's withdrawal back to Virginia. He recognized that his invasion had failed completely. He had not destroyed the Army of the Potomac. He had not threatened Washington or forced Lincoln to negotiate. He had not won the decisive victory that might have brought European recognition of the Confederacy. Instead, he had suffered approximately 28,000 casualties, roughly 1/3 of his entire army, including many of his most experienced and irreplaceable officers and men. The Army of Northern Virginia remained a formidable fighting force, but it would never again possess the offensive capability it had brought to Gettysburg. That evening, Lee drafted orders for a retreat to begin on the night of July 4th. The army would move southwest toward the Potomac River, taking the same route it had used during the invasion but now carrying thousands of wounded men in a wagon train that would stretch for 17 miles. Lee placed Major General John Imboden in command of this wagon train, a responsibility that Imboden later described as the most heart-wrenching duty of his military career. The screams of wounded men jolted over rough roads, the shortage of medical supplies, the desperate searches for water, all combined to create scenes of suffering that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. July 4th dawned rainy and miserable, and the two armies faced each other across the blood-soaked valley, neither willing to renew the battle. Union soldiers emerged from their entrenchments to collect the wounded and bury the dead, a task that would take days to complete. Confederate soldiers prepared for the long march back to Virginia, gathering supplies, organizing wagon trains, tending to wounded comrades who might survive the journey. The Battle of Gettysburg was over, and both armies knew instinctively that something fundamental had changed, though the war would continue for nearly 2 more years. According to historical analyses published in numerous Civil War histories, Lee's defeat at Gettysburg marked the beginning of the Confederacy's decline and demonstrated that the Army of Northern Virginia, despite its fighting spirit, could not overcome the Union's superior resources when matched against a competent opponent on favorable ground. The Confederate wagon train carrying 7,000 wounded soldiers began moving south from Gettysburg on the night of July 4th, and the 17-mile-long column of suffering humanity became a testament to the true cost of war that statistics alone could never convey. Major General John Imboden, commanding the train's escort, rode alongside wagons where wounded men screamed with every jolt over the rough roads. Many had received only the most basic medical attention: tourniquets tied above amputated limbs, rough bandages covering terrible wounds, no morphine to dull the agony. The rain that began falling that morning continued through the night, turning roads into rivers of mud and adding misery upon misery. Behind the wagon train, Lee withdrew his army in a masterful retreat that demonstrated his skill as a commander even in defeat. He positioned his 3 corps to protect the wagon train and to defend against any Union pursuit. Lieutenant General James Longstreet's 1st Corps formed the rear guard, while Lieutenant General Richard Ewell's 2nd Corps and Lieutenant General Ambrose Powell Hill's 3rd Corps covered the flanks and center. Lee knew that Meade would eventually pursue, and he needed to reach the Potomac River crossings before the Union Army could cut him off and force him to fight with his back against the river. Meade, pressured by President Lincoln and General-in-Chief Henry Halleck to pursue and destroy Lee's army, moved cautiously. He had stopped Lee's invasion and won a significant victory, but his army was exhausted and depleted. Moreover, Meade understood the dangers of pursuing a wounded but still dangerous enemy. Commanded by Robert Lee, the Army of the Potomac began moving south on July 5th, following parallel routes to Lee's line of march, probing for opportunities to strike at the retreating Confederates without risking a major battle that might reverse his Gettysburg victory. The pursuit became a race to the Potomac, with Lee desperate to cross the river before Meade could trap him on the northern bank. Lee's army reached Williamsport, Maryland on July 7th, only to discover that recent heavy rains had raised the Potomac to flood stage, making fording impossible, and that Union cavalry had destroyed the pontoon bridge at Falling Waters. Lee found himself trapped north of the river with his wounded, his supplies running low, and the Union Army approaching. He immediately began constructing defensive earthworks along a ridgeline near Williamsport, preparing for what might be a final, desperate battle. For a week, the two armies faced each other across the muddy Maryland fields, while Lee's engineers worked feverishly to construct a new pontoon bridge and waited for the river to fall enough to permit fording. Meade probed the Confederate defenses and called a council of war on July 12 to determine whether to attack Lee's fortified position. The Corps' commanders split on the question, with some favoring an immediate assault and others counseling caution. Meade decided to attack on July 14 after completing reconnaissance of the Confederate lines, but Lee had no intention of waiting to be attacked. On the night of July 13, with the river finally low enough to ford and a new pontoon bridge completed, the Army of Northern Virginia crossed back into Virginia. The operation was conducted with remarkable efficiency. Artillery and wagons crossed on the pontoon bridge while infantry waded across at the fords, and by dawn on July 14, the entire army except for the rearguard stood on Virginia soil. When Union troops advanced to attack that morning, they found empty Confederate entrenchments and a rearguard already across the river. The escape across the Potomac brought bitter recriminations. President Lincoln, who had hoped that Meade would trap and destroy Lee's army, expressed his disappointment in characteristically poignant terms. "We had them within our grasp. We had only to stretch forth our hands, and they were ours. And nothing I could say or do could make the army move." Lincoln drafted a letter to Meade expressing his frustration but never sent it, perhaps recognizing that Meade had achieved something no previous Army of the Potomac commander had accomplished. He had defeated Robert Lee in open battle. Lee's army settled into camps along the Rapidan River in Virginia, and the long process of recovery and reorganization began. Officers compiled casualty lists that revealed the true cost of the Gettysburg campaign: 28,000 casualties from an army of 75,000, with a disproportionate number of losses among field officers and senior enlisted men. Entire regiments had been decimated. Some companies could muster only a handful of men. The Army of Northern Virginia remained a dangerous fighting force, but it had lost the aura of invincibility that had surrounded it since the 7 Days Battles of 1862. Lee submitted his resignation to President Jefferson Davis, taking full responsibility for the defeat and offering to step aside if Davis believed new leadership was needed. Davis refused the resignation, recognizing that Lee remained the Confederacy's best hope for eventual victory despite the Gettysburg disaster. But the strategic situation had fundamentally changed. The South could no longer hope to win through offensive operations in the North. From Gettysburg onward, the Confederacy would fight a defensive war, trying to hold on long enough that Northern public opinion would turn against the conflict and force Lincoln to negotiate a settlement. The immediate aftermath of Gettysburg transformed the town itself into one enormous hospital where 21,000 wounded men from both armies required care that stretched the tiny community's resources beyond any imaginable limit. Every church, school, barn, and many private homes became makeshift hospitals where overworked surgeons performed amputations and treated horrific wounds with inadequate supplies and primitive medical understanding. The citizens of Gettysburg, numbering only 2,400 before the battle, suddenly found themselves responsible for caring for nearly 10 times their population in wounded soldiers, many of whom would die in the coming weeks despite all efforts to save them. The burial of the dead presented an even more overwhelming challenge. Approximately 7,000 soldiers had been killed during the 3 days of fighting, and their bodies lay scattered across 25 square miles of battlefield, decomposing rapidly in the July heat. Initial burial efforts were hasty and inadequate. Shallow graves marked only with crude wooden boards, if marked at all. Confederate dead were particularly poorly interred, often in mass graves or trenches with little effort to identify individual bodies. The stench of death hung over Gettysburg through the summer of 1863, and residents reported that the smell of rotting flesh persisted for months. Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin visited Gettysburg in mid-July and was horrified by the conditions he found. He immediately initiated plans for a proper burial ground where Union soldiers could be interred with dignity. Local attorney David Wills took charge of purchasing 17 acres on Cemetery Hill for what would become the Soldiers' National Cemetery. The reinterment of Union dead began in October 1863, with each body carefully exhumed from its battlefield grave, identified if possible, and reburied in the new cemetery organized by state of origin. The work continued through the spring of 1864, eventually bringing 3,512 Union soldiers to their final resting place. On November 19, 1863, the cemetery was formally dedicated in a ceremony that drew thousands of visitors to Gettysburg. Edward Everett, the most famous orator of his age, delivered a 2-hour address that meticulously described the battle and placed it in classical historical context. Then President Abraham Lincoln rose to deliver what he characterized as a few appropriate remarks. His address lasted approximately 2 minutes and comprised just 272 words, and most contemporary observers considered it a minor addition to Everett's grand oration. History would judge very differently. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address transcended its immediate occasion to become one of the most important speeches in American history. redefining the war's meaning and America's founding principles, where the Constitution had carefully avoided mentioning equality. Lincoln declared that the nation was conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He transformed the war from a legalistic dispute about federal authority into a moral crusade for human equality. He redefined the Union cause as a test of whether democratic government could survive, famously declaring that the war would determine whether government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The military significance of Gettysburg became clearer as the war continued. Lee's army never recovered the offensive capability it possessed before the battle. The Confederacy would launch one more major offensive, Jubal Early's raid on Washington in July 1864, but this was a diversionary operation rather than a serious attempt at invasion. Meanwhile, on July 4, 1863, while Lee's army retreated from Gettysburg, Ulysses Simpson Grant accepted the surrender of Vicksburg, giving the Union complete control of the Mississippi River and splitting the Confederacy in two. Together, Gettysburg and Vicksburg marked the war's turning point, the moment when Confederate hopes for independence began their long decline toward inevitable defeat. The human cost of Gettysburg was staggering even by Civil War standards, approximately 51,000 casualties in 3 days, making it the bloodiest battle ever fought in North America. Families across both North and South received the devastating news that fathers, sons, and brothers would never return home. The casualty lists published in newspapers stretched column after column, and entire communities went into mourning. The battle produced countless individual tragedies. Brigadier General Lewis Armistead and Major General Winfield Scott Hancock had been close friends before the war, and Armistead died from wounds received during his assault on Hancock's position. Colonel Isaac Avery of North Carolina, mortally wounded on East Cemetery Hill, wrote his final message in his own blood: "Tell my father I died with my face to the enemy." Gettysburg's influence extended far beyond the war itself, shaping how Americans understood their history and national identity. The battlefield became hallowed ground, preserved first by veterans associations and later by the National Park Service. The monuments erected on the field over subsequent decades transformed Gettysburg into an outdoor sculpture garden where regimental pride and sectional reconciliation competed for expression in granite and bronze. Veterans of both armies returned to Gettysburg for reunions, most famously in July 1913 for the battle's 50th anniversary, when aging survivors shook hands across the stone walls where they had tried to kill each other as young men. The Battle of Gettysburg decided the Civil War's outcome by destroying the Confederacy's last realistic hope of winning through military victory. After Gettysburg, the South could only hope to prolong the conflict until Northern public opinion turned against the war, a strategy that came tantalizingly close to success in the dark summer of 1864 but ultimately failed. The battle also decided the future of the United States by ensuring that the nation would remain united, that slavery would eventually be abolished, and that the principle of equality, however imperfectly realized, would become central to American identity. Those 3 days in July 1863 shaped not only the war's military outcome but also the moral and political character of the nation that emerged from the conflict. The story of Gettysburg remains powerful more than 160 years after the battle because it speaks to fundamental questions about courage, sacrifice, leadership, and the terrible cost of war. The soldiers who fought there, whether they wore blue or gray, displayed remarkable bravery in circumstances of unimaginable horror. The commanders who led them made decisions that determined the fate of millions of people who would never see the battlefield, and the battle itself demonstrated both the nobility and the tragedy of armed conflict. Noble in the courage displayed by individuals fighting for causes they believed in, tragic in the enormous suffering inflicted and the thousands of promising lives cut short. Gettysburg reminds us that great historical moments are made by ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, and that the choices made in such moments echo through generations.